Contact with Chris Hedges. Welcome to On Contact. Today we discuss Islam and the modern world with the Islamic scholar Shaykh Hamza Yusuf.
If a 9/11 event happened today, we would not see the type of responses that we saw. There won't be any flowers at the mosques.
On Contact, neoliberalism is patriotism. Truth is not. Socialism, counterweight, class war, corporate coup d'etat, utopian ideology of neoliberalism, revolts unmasked. On Contact with Chris Hedges. Islamic jihadists, like the Christian right, are religious heretics. They have far more in common with each other than they do with co-believers. They each sanctify violence. They see evil as embodied in other races they must exterminate. They believe any action that brings them closer to paradise on earth, no matter how cruel or barbaric, is justified. They have been vomited up from the wreckage of predatory global capitalism and empire, which has cast millions of the young adrift. They find in their fundamentalist beliefs a sanctification of their rage and victimhood. Becoming a Christian warrior, a jihadist, a champion of an absolute and pure ideal is an intoxicating conversion that lifts believers out of profound despair. These converts create a binary universe divided between good and evil. They believe they are anointed to change history by destroying power structures around them. They embrace a hyper-masculine violence as a cleansing agent for the world's contaminants, including those people who belong to other belief systems, races, and cultures. They are our new fascists. RT correspondent Anya Parampel examines the rise of Islamophobia in the U.S. since 9/11.
With anything, yeah.
One of the tragedies that I've seen throughout the Muslim world is the assault against traditional Sufi Islam.
Right.
And I think it's fairly well documented that Wahhabism, which has fed ideologically many of these movements we see, and of course with Saudi money, was certainly at its inception promoted by Western interests. I think during the Ottoman Empire, the British stoked Wahhabism as a way to fight against Sufi influence, and of course the current ruling Saudi family has embraced it. We saw with the oil deals in the early 1930s, even to the point of American oil companies paying for the publication of Wahhabist literature. And because of the financial resources, this has poisoned much of the religious discourse, I think you would agree, throughout not only the Muslim world, but even beyond.
Well, I think what's happened, I think the traditionalists, what we'd call the traditionalists, which certainly Sufism was a large part of classical Islamic tradition, the traditionalists have never dealt with the fact that they ossified into a very sterile tradition with a lot of, it was no longer a living tradition. In Catholicism, they differentiate between tradition and traditionalism. The tradition is the living faith of the dead. Traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. And in many ways, they are, this is what happened. And so there were reactions to that. What's called Wahhabism, they don't like to be called Wahhabis, but what's called Wahhabism was actually a type of Protestant reformist movement in Arabia that eventually allied with a political force, Al Saud. And so the religious and the political became allied in this. And because of the petrodollars, they were able to spread a very different type of Islam that most of the Muslim world was comfortable with. But a couple of things that I have to say, and I think this is really important. The scholars of the Saudi Arabian kingdom have consistently been against suicide bombing. And this is not true of the Sunni scholars generally. They have consistently, there is no Saudi scholar outside of the heretical ones, even within their own tradition.
That suicide is prohibited.
It's prohibited in Islam,
right.
And they are the only ones that really stuck to that. Other than some Sufis generally didn't, but most of the Sunni scholarship I felt completely sold out on that issue. And if you read their fatwas, it's all emotional. There's no rational argument. It's all about Palestine, and this is our only way. I have a friend who said...
This is what Osama bin Laden did, who had no religious legitimacy to issue fatwas.
No religious training at all. And so, I mean, you know The Devil's Game, Dreyfus's book, which is a very important book. And I would argue there's a few books...
We should say what that is. The Devil's Game argues...
It's about how America really funded Islamic fundamentalism because they were so worried about Russian influence in the region.
We're talking about the war in Afghanistan.
Many places, because there's a lot of proxy wars, and then there's also a lot of other stuff going on. But if you really want to take it back, I think you have to go back to David Fromkin's The Peace to End All Peace, and recognize that World War I never ended, and that the Middle East was a front. It was the Middle Eastern front during World War I. Iraq was a big part of that. World War II is a direct result of the Versailles Treaty, that the humiliation of the German people. You would not have had Hitler and the rise of Hitler without the collapse of the Deutschmark because of the Weimar Republic and the incredible humiliation that they were faced with.
Great. When we come back, we'll hear more from Islamic scholar Shaykh Hamza Yusuf. Welcome back to On Contact. We'll continue our conversation with Islamic scholar and president of Zaytuna College, Shaykh Hamza Yusuf. Let's talk about what's been happening to disenfranchised Muslim youth, both in Europe, in the banlieues of France, where people are mostly North African Muslims, 5 million, segregated. I've been to those banlieues, the Cité de 4000 and others. The French prisons are filled with North African, disproportionately with North African Muslims in the way that our prisons are filled with poor people of color. The racism is overt in countries like Belgium. Despair, loss of hope. And this is also true in huge swaths of the Muslim world itself, which has not been exempt from predatory capitalism. And one of the things you once said to me that I think is true, having spent a lot of time in the Middle East, is that so many of the people who are seduced by this ideology have a kind of loss of identity or struggle, but they also don't come out of religious backgrounds.
Yeah. You will almost never find a religiously educated, and if they are, they're autodidacts, or they've come out of an extremist tradition already, if you can call it a tradition. You will not find the madrasas, which are always being blamed for producing these people. In the madrasas, these are the
Islamic schools.
Right, the Islamic
Many
colleges.
of them in countries like Pakistan, funded by the Saudis.
Some of them, yeah, certainly, but many of them are still traditional schools. Like I studied in a madrasa, and it was Aristotelian logic and rhetoric and things like that.
This was in Mauritania?
In Mauritania, yeah, in Morocco. But if you look, Europe is very different from the United States. Europe, the immigration to Europe was the result of the after effects of World War II, because they brought in a lot of Muslims to rebuild Europe. Europe was devastated, as you know. London was aerial bombardment, Liverpool. So they brought in a lot of their, the colonial peoples to do all the labor and work. So these were not educated people, whereas in the United States, immigration has been, it was a Cold War immigration, and so it was the brain drain from the Muslim world. So many of the most highly skilled and educated Muslims came to America. That's why we have so many doctors and engineers. And so they're very different communities. The American community, Muslim community, is actually doing quite well. I mean, economically, and so, and many of them feel very comfortable here. They feel enfranchised because in America you can come to America and you can become an American in about 5 years, and then generally most Americans, I mean, we have a lot of racism, but most Americans accept the immigrant traditionally. I mean, we've got a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric right now for many reasons. So I think they're very different. But in Europe, you're dealing with profoundly disenfranchised people that have never been allowed to become French. They've never been allowed to become English. They don't feel English, they don't feel French. And so with the racism...
Let me just add there that when they go back to Algeria or Tunisia, and they may have been born there and left as a... They don't feel Algerian or Tunisian either.
This is exactly it. The identity is in crises.
Right.
And so the third group, which is the extremist group, come join us and be part of this brotherhood. It's like a gang. And when you have in the African American inner cities, a gang is membership. And so many of the African American youth or Hispanic youth are pulled into these, or skinheads, some disenfranchised white youth that are pulled into the white gang mentality.
And of course, if we look at the history of many of the people who have carried out acts of terrorism in Europe, they come out of a petty and often not even petty criminal class.
Exactly, criminal class. I have said the same thing. The same thing is true here. Many of these people, we have a large conversion rate in prisons. And if those people aren't nurtured and cared for because they've grown up in very difficult situations, and if they're given a rhetoric of rage, if they're given a divinely legitimized version of reality that otherizes all of these people, they can become an incredibly dangerous force, and that's happened. But again, I want to point out that when you look at the numbers, these are very small numbers.
Right.
It's so exaggerated. We have 15,000 people die every year from low tire pressure in America. And the numbers of people that have gone overseas from America, you're looking at less than 1,000 people. If you look at the overall Muslim community, it's probably close to 10 million with the children. It's a very insignificant number, and yet it's blown out of with the...
Well, let's talk about that, because